the echoes billowing through all the sound again.
I'm glad there's some people here, because otherwise it would just be a normal night in our house as we chat about roleplay. We do have a few people. Hi, everyone who's joined us already. Hello to everyone watching afterwards. I'm going to work out how to sort out my streaming to YouTube so we can go live on that for the next stream. I'm just waiting for some approvals to come through. In the meantime, welcome to Urban Settings with Andy Law. So we decided to pop this live stream in because Andy wasn't very well when we did our initial Rookery chat about settings, and there was quite a few questions that we thought we would love to hear from him, and luckily you guys agreed with us and provided us with some more questions to ask Andy. So
happy to oblige. I'll admit I have a slightly different background to everyone else because I don't just write, I don't just draw, I don't just put everything together. I've had my fingers dipped into almost every single pie when it comes to role playing and cities. So I've GM'd them, I've played them, I've written them, I've drawn them. I've developed other people's work as they develop their own versions of them. So I have a slightly different view to everybody else when it comes to these things. So hopefully a few of the questions will, can I sing them? And thus the questions begin. Yes!
He's quite a good singer, actually.
I'm great at it.
He's got a very good ear, but his music theory leaves a lot to be desired.
Quite. So let's go.
So I'll jump in. So Prince Blackmore, I'll jump in with a big question. Why use a city when a town will do?
I think that's a very good question in that you could argue that everything you can get in a town, you can get in a city, and it depends entirely on the campaign that you yourself are building. For example, if you're playing a game of vampire, your average population inside a town just doesn't sustain a big vampire population, so you want to up it a bit. If you're playing a game that's more fantasy-based, cities bring a host of not unique, but most certainly different advantages. For example, you won't just have a group or 4 or 5 groups or one cult or religion or 4 or 5 cults or religion, depending if you're polytheistic or not. You get a lot of different tools as a GM to play with. Ultimately, though, I think that the biggest answer to this question is, what story are you telling? If indeed you are telling a story, and that will provide you with the answer. There are all manner of things that a city will offer, but I think we know most of these already. One of the great joys of working with the Rookery is that we're not speaking to noobs. We're not trying to entice people into the hobby here. We're speaking to people who've been doing this often for decades. And one of the great joys of that is that we can just hand wave a lot of this stuff because we know it, while simultaneously picking out the individual questions that you're quite interested in picking on. So ultimately, my answer to that would be, depends on the story you're telling.
How do you get the feel of a big city across? A busy city, sorry.
A busy city. So we're talking at the table as a GM, looking to try and make sure that it feels like it's busy. You can cheat. One of the easiest cheats is just to get some noise going. And that means picking yourself up one of the various sounds that you can get online or using one of the apps that provides it for you. You can do that. It works. It's quick. It's a shorthand. It's like providing a picture for an NPC that you're showing for the first time, so that you don't need to describe what that NPC is like. Obviously, that NPC will develop through play as you, I don't know, hunch your back or use a particular accent, or perhaps you have a prop. And the same can be said for a city. You can do a quick shorthand version if you wish. Another one is to ensure that all of your descriptions as you're making your way through town are peppered with the necessary busy chat. So, for example, you don't just say you're walking down the street, you're talking about having to push through the street, or occasionally having to even do a test to get from A to B. Also, it's worth ensuring that as people are traveling across their city or something similar, that if you wish to give that idea that it's super busy, make things slow. Make it clear that it takes a long time to get from A to B if they're not paying money. There's all manner of little things that you can do, and I imagine we can get ourselves some fun ones popping up into the comments from other GMs who do something similar. For me, the big one, if I'm doing it, is just simply pepper my descriptions with extra bits and bobs that give you the idea that every action that you're doing is being impacted by somebody else. So if you fight, everyone hears. If there's perception tests, everything is going to be pared back as you can barely see over the crowds, or whatever it is that, for your local environment.
Yeah, Flip-Top, I use sounds in all my games now, regardless of settings. I even hide cues about things happening. I wasn't sure what they meant there, but now I read it twice. I get what you mean.
And I think they've got a very good point here, particularly for a lot of people's modern role-playing, where people are role-playing online. And when you're role-playing online, it can often be quite difficult to build that mood because you've got a less direct form of interaction, or in some other ways, a far more direct form of interaction. So doing something to help build up that mood really can help. And yes, sound cues and using them to foreshadow what might be coming is a good thing. I mean, just as on the simplest of fronts, we ran a vampire game for far too long, and whenever I hear the Dracula soundtrack, that's it. I am there, back in whichever particular century we happen to be playing through at the time. So yes, sound is powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if you've seen the chat on Discord, but there was a little bit of chat about cities, towns, villages themselves having character sheets, having sounds which would determine their wounds. Did you have any?
Yes, in fact, one of the things that we're doing, because we're building a city as part of the many Rookery products that we're putting together. And one of the things that we've got going on in the background is how to ensure that the different districts can be properly characterized and all have their own individual flavors for when the GM tries to present them at the table, and providing the GM with all of the tools necessary for them to do that. And one of the simplest way to do that is much like our NPCs, for those of you who are part of the Ship of Fools playtest. For those of you who weren't, it'll be coming soon. You'll find that the PCs had a very simple character sheet. It's very simple, but a lot of it was descriptive. Somewhat similarly, the districts are handled in a similar fashion. So basic characteristics, so you understand exactly what their key points are, while simultaneously being added to by description. I think it's a good idea, and I think it can also be utilized as an easy, hot button to press for the GM when things change. So if there's an uprising, using that uprising and changing the stats appropriately can also be used as a visible tool for the players who can see it right in front of them. Because if you're playing in your average town, you say, okay, you come to this particular place, and you can tell through a certain amount of role play that it is I don't know, a lawful district where everybody is, broadly speaking, obeying the law. Through the course of the PCs coming in and doing what PCs do, that place could become an unlawful hellhole, and the stats change. And it's a handy, quick way for you to show that to the players, the power of their interaction with the world.
I think when I was very first rolling up my character for, I think it was 2nd edition Warhammer, and we literally randomized where she came from, it would have been handy to have that little gazetteer that you got to have be like a bestiary for cities, and have, you know, like the NPC character sheets that we've got, a few descriptions. You'll never guess about the city. I think that would have been amazing. And Flip-Top says they may have bitten off more than they can chew. In one of their home games, they're doing a Wifrup game that is a settlement building game, kind of like Pathfinder Kingmaker. I would not want to get started, but can I just say that one of my favorite settlement house building games was one Andy did for me when I got to run a dark elf house in Nagaroth. Amazing. Such good fun. I'm a big fan of a settlement building game.
To a degree, what I did was much like Flip-Top suggests there with their idea. I have run those campaigns and have got one sort of twiddling along in the background as well. And I've taken a lot more inspiration than I'd like to admit from games like Warhammer Total War, but less Warhammer Total War, more medieval Total War. All the different settlement expansions that you can purchase your way into, and the effect that they then have on game. And it's fun. It gives a whole host of mini-game targets for the players to engage with as they go, well, I want to build myself a tavern now so that I can attract more people to my settlement. So I'm completely with Flip-Top on that one.
So here's a design question. I know that this is a bit of a thing for you. How do you manage mapping a city in the scale population? It seems a lot of city sizes I see feel a bit off, especially with fantasy medieval cities. Right.
So I have a lot of opinions on this one. Since time immemorial, it feels sometimes, I've been building Warhammer maps. Let's start with those. And a great deal of that was building a host of demographics that would support the maps that we're presenting. So we're not just talking about cities, we're talking about, say, for example, the entire empire, which is one of the primary setting places in Warhammer. And I built the demographics for the entire empire, populations for the entire place, how big the cities would have to be to support those populations. Also, how big those populations would have to be to support the total war, so to speak, that goes on in the Warhammer world, and to ensure that it was the right size. Well worth it. Totally worked. And it gave me some populations that most people didn't expect, particularly because the empire is significantly larger than the Holy Roman Empire from history, for example. And going further than that, the implications in the population centers of the old world in Warhammer and the lack of equivalence in our real world. So what is the equivalent in the old world was fascinating. Some cities massively inflated, some became a good bit smaller. Now, looking at this one, I've got one other thing as well before I move on to my concluding point. The next one that really blew my mind when I was mapping was Game of Thrones. When I was mapping King's Landing. King's Landing inside the books is truly enormous. A population of millions. It's immense. The city is leagues across, not just 1 or 2 miles, several leagues. There's near the very beginning of the series, Arya pops down into some tunnels and pops out near the docks, and she travels such a long distance. And there's some lovely actual descriptions of just how far she's traveled and how many leagues have been passed, and she's still in the city. It's truly immense. And Yuzarian, I'm going to guess is how to pronounce that. Yuzarian. You can write that in the comments. Is completely spot on. The population wasn't just off; it's massively off. Exactly the same go for settings like, I'm thinking of the big wars that were happening at the Wheel of Time at the end of that. The cities in there made no sense at all in the slightest. And you're spot on. Now, the next question is, does it matter? And the answer is, well, that's up to you. Me, sometimes yes, sometimes no. And when it comes to actually mapping it in the scale of the population, I get super, super anal. I like everything to be right. If a town has a population of 10,000, I want it to be the right size. Equally, if it's got a population of 1 million and it's not a town, it's a city, it needs to be the right size to actually field that population. If I think back on one where I had quite a lot of discussion about this, it'd probably be the first city map that I did for, oh golly, I can't remember the name of the game. I'll pop it up into the comments later on YouTube or pop it into Discord. It was a big city, and ensuring that it had the right size, and the rock that it stood atop, much like Middenheim and Warhammer, is on top of a gigantic plateau. The rock that it stood upon had to be big enough to field that location, so we completely changed it. I'll put a link on the Discord channel afterwards where that map is. It's a crazy city, but I want to make it right, and I do every single time, whether it's checking up Renaissance demographics, medieval demographics, more modern demographics, and the different spreads or the pools together for how they work. Because a lot of medieval towns were a lot smaller than people think for their population sizes. And when you start moving into fantasy races, they can often get an awful lot smaller. If you've got yourself a fantasy race that is renowned for being living in each other's pockets, you might find yourself with 4, 5, 6, 700 people living inside a single block, like ants in a colony. Even humans do that to a degree. If you take a look at your average horrible slum, there was often 4, 5 to 20, 30 people living inside single blocks of rooms. And ensuring that you get the proper population densities to then balance out towards your building of the maps, like if you're building a big Freeport map like the one up there, for example, is pretty important.
Yep. I just put this one up because it is interesting. Need 5 people in the countryside for every person in the city. I guess the one, how mechanized is your farming, but also what the addition of more complex factors in fantasy worlds. Yeah. What does magic do in terms of farming and providing food? What does the different technology that you would have, the mechanizations of different species, etc.?
Yeah, and these are all good questions. I'm going to pick out this one in particular as well, because that stands very hard against the classic setting of, say, Warhammer, one of the settings I've done a lot of work on in the past. Warhammer is all about the islands of civilization, the towns and the cities with the vast tracts of wilderness that lie in between, whether that's the forests, whether that's the dark horrors that live in there. And that's often how the game pitches itself. Farmlands are not the big 5-to-1s that you would get in the real world. And feeding those people that live in their great cities is one of the great adventures as a writer, because you have to now look at that and say, okay, well, where's the bread basket? And then how does all of that food get to the city? How can we make this work yet still maintain those islands of civilization? And indeed, any of the various fantasy settings you look at, the second they start adding other species that live out there in the wild, and they are doing horrible things, whether it's monsters, whether it's big gribblies, whether it's actually other intelligent species that live out there doing whatever it is that they do, that eats into territory. The politics become difficult. Wars become an inevitability. Territory is claimed. Where is the farmlands? And that's part of the fun of the world building, and often is forgotten. And as someone who comes into other people's IPs, which I sometimes do, one of my fun parts of my job is rationalizing and making it make sense.
This is, do you know, I've thought about this one. Where's the breadbasket? Does anyone know the answer to that question for Minas Tirith, the movie?
No. It's just grasslands forever. They don't eat. They're all ghosts.
So I had this one. Do you think our modern, this was from Discord, our modern perception of what a city is or looks like influences the way we design cities for fantasy settings? And so, if so, in what way and what should we avoid? This takes me back to when I was pregnant and you were away, and I felt very lonely in my concrete sandstone box, and it felt really profoundly like not the way that we had evolved to live over millions of years. And that really struck me, that the way our cities are now is not really the way cities have been. Western cities, you know, obviously there are some differences, but in general, they're not the way they would be.
Yeah. Social living, and also living within a stone's throw of your family, always living within a stone's throw of your family, very rarely not living within a stone's throw of your family. It's very much one major difference of modern living to historical living. But I'm going to take this question a slightly different direction to how many would. Do you think our modern perception of what a city looks is influences? Absolutely. It can't help but do. You write what you know. And if you happen to have done a lot of reading around, say, for example, a medieval setting, and you're building a medieval setting, obviously your reading will inform what you create. But if you don't, then what you believe a city is almost certainly going to be how you present it. And I'm then going to the next one. In what way, what should we avoid? Absolutely nothing. These are often fantasy, unless you're trying to be historically accurate, which some people try to be. I wouldn't worry about it. We're playing games here. And there is a great deal to be said for having fun. What should we avoid? Anything you think is important to avoid. Everybody has got their own tolerances. Some people don't like modern swear words, for example. This is something that's popped up in some of our discussions at the Rookery. They don't like modern swear words being used in a historical context. Completely understandable. Other people don't like the idea of modern social constructs being imported back into historical social constructs. And again, that's totally fine. Other people don't care. And at your table, and what you work with is the gold. And what you enjoy is the important things. And what you enjoy is almost certainly going to be related to what you know. And what you know is modern living with a dash of medievalism or Renaissance or something historical added to it. And that's fine, particularly if everyone's enjoying themselves and if that's what they expect. Now, when it comes to writing it, I'm going to flip it right in its head and say it's almost the exact opposite. Deep historical research does nothing more than bring out all the nuggets from the past that are just usable in games, again and again and again. And we like to present those to players, because often your average GM or your average player hasn't done all of that research. You're average. Many of them have done far more.
Or they've just researched something else. I mean,
exactly.
The world is a vast place.
It totally is. So we like to bring all of those little bits to the table and bring our own twists to them. So we're not just repeating what came before. We're taking history. We're taking all the great depth of human experience, and we're saying this is another way that it could express. And often in a fantasy context, that can be dialed up to 11 and still feel like it's
I'm just going to bring
No.
up this comment from Darker Days Radio. A really good book for city building for Vampire is Damnation City. I feel like this maybe came up in the last stream for Vampire the Requiem, reference for V5 and other game lines, and has lots of tools about building up city districts, NPCs, running
chases. Yeah, that's a big one. Running chases.
Here's one. One of the things I'm struggling with just now is basics like water for bathing. Any suggestions for how to deal with it in a fantasy setting? Water guild, maybe magically enhanced plumbing. I mean, I guess, you know, if you look to ancient Rome, they had a lot of water for bathing. They had a lot of water for heating their homes. They had, you know, what are they called? Aqueducts, internal plumbing, etc., etc.
I'm not going to answer this from the perspective that, again, might be expected. I would be looking for what is the primary themes of the city that you're building. What type of story are you telling? Not necessarily what is the story, but what type of story. If you're telling a story all about betrayal, for example, you're going to want to make sure that anything that you build into that city has at its core something to do with betrayal. And then you can wend around those themes in a variety of different ways with each one of the different locations that you build. So, for example, with how to deal with water, for example, if we're dealing with betrayal, then we need to have someone that's commodifying it in some fashion, or someone that's using it or controlling it, which means that immediately you start to spin up some answers for how water is handled in that city. You could alternatively have something like the old Edinburgh wells, and I'll recognize that you'll recognize those since I know you're from Edinburgh. And the old Edinburgh wells that were spotted up and down, and they drew water all the way up into the city, many of which were taken from pipes from lochs many miles away, wooden pipes at that. So you think they wouldn't work, but they did.
Yeah, and actually, that's like your dad joke. People being poisoned by bad pipes, something I've been considering. Yeah, Edinburgh had massive wooden pipes. You can see them next to the old Royal Infirmary, big hollowed out ones. And I have a theory that they were partially responsible for the Scottish Enlightenment because they
didn't use lead. Yeah, they didn't use lead pipes, so there wasn't that heavy metal inside everybody turning them into idiots. We used wooden pipes because we did. And even those small differences make a big difference for how you're going to be characterizing your city. So I think my first point would be a suggestion to worry about your theme first. And then when you do that, you'll find that the answers for all of your different individual locations will slowly but surely unravel. And ultimately, it's all about individual characters making individual decisions and then everyone working around those.
I have got another question here, which is, do you have a stack of old city maps?
Well,
I've brought some props. These are just the ones I could find in the 2 minutes before the stream as I ran round our house collecting maps. There's more maps. I got this one from a charity shop shelter. It's a German geographical map.
Always essential.
We've got 3 copies, I think, of this book. I think one is 3.
One of the joys of having won several awards for doing maps is that everybody
so yeah
sends map books. And that's good if I don't have that map book. But when it comes to some of the map books, I've got several copies of them. But that's just a part and parcel of it. So the answer to that is yes.
Absolutely. And when Andy was the main house dad and I was the main, what shall we call me?
Money earner.
Breadwinner. Yeah, like whatever.
Winner.
I used to travel more for work, so I would pick up like random second-hand books. I send him pictures of maps I see wherever I go and things of architecture. So he's constantly being fed, from me at least, a constant diet.
Well, it's fun because for all your average fantasy map these days tends to be a computer-generated piece of frippery. Not always the case. There's some beautiful cartographers out there who do something different. I like whenever I pick up a new project to ask what they're looking for, and often the client will ask for something that's really different to what I've done before. So having all of those maps in hand means that I have an immediate, well, would it be like this one or like this one or like this one, which is good fun.
Oh, I did find something else. In my run round, I also found this.
Oh, look at that. That's the original Fimmer image. The very first one.
Fimmer came up on the stream last week, actually. And there's, I think these are some original.
Yes, they are. Oh, they're all Tony Ackland stuff. They're the best. They get hidden away. We've only got one of We've got one of Tony Ackland's pieces up there. That's the dwarf from Warhammer First Edition.
The next
Tunnel Runner.
question. Have you ever
Anyway,
chosen
yes, questions.
a holiday destination primarily to study the location for game design inspiration? We have a couple of friends who pick their holiday destinations based on the board games they have. So they played Carcassonne in Carcassonne. They played Bruges in Bruges. They've played
While watching in Bruges.
While watching Bruges, yeah, that was a bit. That was even more meta.
On our case,
a holiday
I find this one quite fascinating because no, but yes, because many of our roleplay worlds have been so deep and so rich. In some respects, we feel like we've not only been to those locations, but the actual real world versions can in no way match or in any way compete with the ones that are inside our minds. Have we been to the pyramids of Egypt? Yes. Did Lindsay live in Marseille for over a century? Yes. She lived in Vancouver for over a century too. Can they in any way match the versions we have in our head? No, because they are our own versions that we've built for our games. And the real world ones, well, it would be tempting actually for good old Tokaido. So yes and no. In that what we're
basically saying is Andy and I go on holiday in our minds.
Yeah, we do. Which is a sad thing to admit.
It is. But that's what you get when you have 2 young children and
and you work in the roleplay industry.
when the interns have left home and are out bringing in their own money, then maybe we'll get to
tour the world and see all those things. Yeah, absolutely. So what's next?
Okay, what is next? What fictional city would you like to roleplay in that isn't already in a setting?
Picking a choice out of that one's tough.
I thought of one, so I didn't have one for the last. I think I can't remember what I said for the last stream, but I was actually thinking of Lyra's Oxford. I think that world, the Golden Compass world, could be super cool, and Lyra's Oxford would be fun.
I mean, it is super lazy to say Mass Effect again.
Yeah.
And the Citadel in Mass Effect, and how poorly utilized it was in terms of the description that it got given. The thing's 45 miles long, yet many of its images make it look like it's only about 5 miles long. And at least it might be not 45, that's off the top of my head. It could be 23 for all I can recall, but it's big. And it's the size of a small country. It's not the size of a city. And they tried to convey that and failed. And roleplay games can convey these things often in a far better way than computer games, in the same way that computer games can sometimes convey things in a far better way than roleplay games, much like the difference between novels and gaming. So, yeah, well, no, I've already started that. I've done it. So that's already in my past. The Rookery has already started playing inside its setting that it's building. So for me, probably Mass Effect, although that's super lazy. If I was to try and think of anything else, is there any other major...
When you were a kid, what would you have, where would you have wanted to?
Well, the big thing with when I was a kid was almost every single major location that I wanted to roleplay in, I did. Either the game existed already, for example, let's say Stormbringer or Elric for Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champion books. They had its own game from Chaosium or Games Workshop, depending on which one you picked up. And that was great. Alternatively, it was a game like when I was a kid, I quite like David Eddings for all. Looking back at those books makes me smile these days. And I loved those books, and we roleplayed there and we used RuneQuest to do that. So almost everything from when I was a kid, we adapted and played. And now that I'm a grown up adult, again, most of them I've adapted and played, which makes it tough. The only one I've never got around to doing is Mass Effect, really. I think
role-playing would be a great way to occupy yourself if you were on a mission to Mars and you had limited room to bring anything with you. So like all astronauts should be taught how to role-play. But it would be pretty cool to play, like what game would you play on your mission to Mars? Would you play a Mass Effect game? Would you play a fantasy game? Like what would you want to do?
And you'd have to be careful not to kill all the players and have everybody hate you.
Yeah.
But yeah, TPK, the whole mission collapses.
Not quite the same, but I'd love Planescape books, either reissued or a new write. Oh, this did come up last time. I think someone else mentioned this.
Oh, yeah, that's a good call.
Or the Malazan Books of the Fallen.
I need to reread those. And yeah, both good calls. And in fact, the Book of the New Sun, definitely a good call. I've never played in that one either. It was a bit too dense for many of my friends to accept when I was reading it, because I read it when I was a preteen. So quite a long time ago now. Oh gosh. But yeah, they're very good. Agreed completely. Indeed, one of the characters in that inspired quite a lot of the details of one of the characters in our vampire game. So yeah. Good stuff.
Oh, it comes again. Spaceship of Fools.
Spaceship of Fools. It always makes me smile.
There is one question I definitely want to get to because it came up, but let's start with this one and then we'll go to the next one. Do you find any limit problems with running games in an urban setting? And while you do that, I'm just going to flick through the comments so people can see what other people would like to.
Yeah, that makes sense. This is a hard one to answer because I tend to find when I'm role-playing or indeed GMing in this particular instance, the limitations are entirely self-imposed if there are any. Cities don't necessarily bring any limitations because everything that you could bring from a more rural environment, you can bring into the city in another fashion without too much difficulty should you wish to do so. Some games are entirely based on city play. Vampires, a clean example of that. Go outside the city, get torn up by werewolves. And the whole point of the game is that you're city-based creatures that feed upon all the inhabitants. Not the point. That's not the point of the game. That's just a fact of the game. So did that in any way feel limiting? No. Does it feel limiting if you're playing a fantasy game and you want to go out again? I feel no. I don't think it is ever limiting if you don't want it to be. I find it hard to find a way that I would feel because any story that I'd want to tell, I can tell inside a city.
So
the biggest issue would be even that can be done because you've got yourself empty districts.
So you're now talking in your mind.
Yeah, I am. Let's move on.
Use your words. So how do you anchor PCs to a city? And I'm specifically here thinking about if your PCs, say, have broken some laws, but your story requires them to be in said city, like how do you get around that? What do you do?
It's a standing joke in our many Warhammer games that at any point, almost when you leave a city at all, not just the classic Altdorf, but it's a standing joke that you leave as outlaws and the outlaw career is the next clear and obvious choice because of whatever happened inside the city. That's rarely because we want people to move on. That's often because PCs are PCs. How to anchor PCs to a city is significantly easier than most people realize. The easiest way to do it is to ask your players to come up with a reason to do it. It is by far the easiest. A lot of GMs are by their nature kind of control freakish. And they want to keep on coming up with clever things to make a certain thing happen. It ends up becoming oddly railroady. The best thing to do is just sit down with the players and say, this is the sort of thing that's happening. How can we make that happen? Because these are the stories we're going to tell. Now, flip that on its head and say, let's say everybody had been cool and they had made some really cool characters that ensured they wanted to stay. Say, for example, they had some dependents that were local that they couldn't abandon. Or say, for example, they were running a business that they had no desire to walk away from. Or they owed somebody some money and there was no way they were going to get away from that one. Whatever it may be. And then they do something really bad. And they do something unfortunate. Or they're framed for it. How do you deal with a PC group that is now on the run, for want of a better description, or has got a significant obstacle before them and the story you're wanting to tell? The answers to that are complex and could possibly take an entire stream by themselves. Loosely, you either A, make it a part of the story. It is the story that you're telling, so you don't worry about it. You just let the story go where it wills, and if they're getting themselves into some form of legal trouble, then you have breakouts and similar fun, exciting stories be part of the next steps of your roleplay session. He bounces his mic there. And there's all manner of ways that you can make being an outlaw et al. Part of the ongoing story. Another way is to, and I'd never do this, but is to go light on your players and sort of ignore it. Many GMs do this because they don't know how to do what's next. I would much prefer have every significant negative choice by the PCs come with a potentially negative outcome from the NPCs towards them. So if they get themselves into a difficult position and they're now caught up with the law and in jail or something similar, a powerful patron frees them for reason X, Y, or Z, and they're now caught up inside that powerful patron's grip. As they have seen the previous PC's antics and gone, well, I want myself a little bit of that. They reach out and they take them by the neck and they use them for other things. That's one way you can lift people out of a difficult situation and drop them into another one. There's all manner of things you can do. Ultimately, use your imagination and press on. The biggest issue for all this one is, what if your story really needs people outside? And the answer to that is, are you telling the right story and have you talked with your group? Because if your group are acting up all over the place and doing things that are breaking the law when you need them to be working within the law, you probably have missed a conversation earlier on in the campaign where you're meant to be law-abiding citizens, or it's not going to work.
I feel foolish that I didn't consider the Expanse RPG on the Martian mission. How do you deal with urban environments in a more unique environment like underwater or underground?
Almost exactly the same way that you do any other urban environment. It's interesting. I've written quite a few of these over the course of time, and it's almost depressing how similar many of them come out. Now, I don't mean depressing from my side when I'm writing them and building something, because I do my very best to try and ensure that all the unique traits of any individual setting are brought to the fore. But the ones I've read, they're often just town underwater, town underground, and there's no great difference for example, how they feed the place, other than there's kelp farms rather than normal farms. Oh, there's now mushroom farms because we're underground. So how do I deal with it specifically? I try to think of what's unique about that setting, and I try to ensure that that is hard baked into and is reflected by not just the NPCs and the world around them, but the stories that we're going to tell. Because if you're not doing that, then that location isn't really being used in terms of its unique opportunities. Now, that's fine. You don't need to. Another city is just another city. But my preference is to try and make sure that it's not just another city, that it's a character, to go back to the earlier character sheet points. And the character of that city will help determine the stories that are told there. So I would very much pick out the unique aspects of that setting, and then ensure the story picked around those points.
Yeah, so flip top, I always ask my players questions rather than making up reasons for myself, like naming and describing non-important NPCs they interact with. That's interesting.
Yeah, that's quite a fun one. I don't do half of that. I generally name all the NPCs myself, which is foolish because sometimes you just can't think of one, or you forget to take notes about it and that name's lost forever. And your way of doing it is probably, in many circumstances, simply better. It's also more interactive, and it can provide a sense of ownership of those NPCs to the players. But generally speaking, not always, but generally, I like to have a world that feels like it's real without the players necessarily being there. So all the characters are running around doing their thing, even if the players weren't there. So they've all got their own hopes and motivations and deals, and that I like to express with the NPCs that are presented as well. And that generally means having not necessarily them all built beforehand, but definitely having a strong idea of what sort of characters I want the PCs to be interacting with. And that generally involves a little bit more pre-planning rather than just letting it go, which I sometimes do too.
I thought this was a good comment. Another thing is establishing limitations early on to some of the crimes. So using the chronicle tenets, which restrict how much characters break the law, masquerade, harm others in V5, adventuring companies, W&G or IKRPG help establish the purpose of the group and the benefits of playing to those.
Yeah, indeed. And having that early conversation about basically what the game's about. And if you are building a game from the ground up, you can very easily hard code it into the mechanics of the game. Vampire, for example, very famously has its humanity trait, which hard codes certain player actions into the very mechanics of the game. And if you go too far down one road, so to speak, you are almost certainly going to hit not just consequences to the setting and the social situation your character finds themselves in for having broken various rules, but quite real mechanical issues as well. And having those tools as a GM can be super useful.
And just a simple question, do you prefer to run games in a big or small urban setting?
Yes. I can't say that I personally have a very strong preference. Both bring different things to the table. A smaller urban setting tends to be easier to be a bit more completionist with if you want to be bothered with that. And you can very much build detail into it and feel like you've covered almost all of it. Where when it comes to a larger city, a lot of your descriptions or a lot of your planning is going to have to be more general by necessity. You're going to be speaking to almost each district as if it's a city in its own right in some respects. And that brings a different set of challenges. I wouldn't say that I prefer one over the other. I like each for the different options that they present, both as a creator and as someone who's running games in those environments.
So do you follow the same process when designing cities, or does it vary a lot based on the brief?
Yeah, massively. Massively. Each brief is very different. You might be working to somebody else's plan, and somebody else's plan, if you're working in somebody else's IP, is paramount. What they are looking for from the project wins over anything that you might want to present. If, for example, they say we are looking for a bunch of small locations that will fit into this district, go sort it out, away you go and you build that. If they're instead, though, looking for an entire setting themselves, you tend to find that's a more collaborative job in general. It depends entirely on the setting. It's never the same process. Each time I built one, it has been different. And equally, helping other people design their ones is a different process almost for every writer. Some writers like a lot of discussion. They like a hands-on approach to how their design work goes. Others prefer to be just left to their own devices and to do their own thing and resent having people coming in and giving them ideas. So not only is it different from the perspective of creating it, it's different from the perspective of helping others create it as well.
So, sorry, I've got a delay. My video is delayed to my voice, so I'm not sure how that's going to come out on the recording afterwards.
I'm sure it'll come out all choppy and horrible. We'll see how that runs at our end. Andy Lease was mentioning this in terms of internet connection earlier. It popped up in the Discord. So yes, what's the next question?
So just a comment there. Small settings are really fun to detail the minutiae. A scenario I wrote for Chronicles of Darkness is a folk horror story based on my own hometown. So almost all the pubs are there, the hotel, the church, etc.
Yeah, and you can cover them all with detail. One of the things that I really enjoyed when I was building up the Empire, for example, was finding all of those little pubs that were mentioned, all of the novels, and making sure that they were properly seated in all the locations where they actually were described as being, and getting them down onto the maps, the ones that were fortified, the ones that weren't. It's just it appeals to the obsessively mapping every last detail part of me. But does that need to be done? Absolutely not. It's often a project that's personal or designed to be published. Very rarely do individual GMs go into all of that detail. It's something that obsessives like myself tend to focus on, though.
So this is when it came up on the Discord. Cities on coast riverbanks. What's your stance on walls separating embankment/docks from the main part of the city?
Yeah, this is actually quite a fascinating one, because I don't care, and that's why it's fascinating. I had to have a little think because I saw this question pop up earlier as to why I don't care, and that's because each setting has different requirements. Now, if it's a historical one and you're in a city and there are no walls, then so be it. But if you're playing in a fantasy setting and they're described as being there, then I have no issue with that at all. If it's a setting that I'm in charge of, though, I'll want there to be a reason. The walls aren't just there. They're there for a reason. For example, I was very recently mapping, I say very recently, it was a few months ago now, very recently mapping, I can't say I'm doing that, still NDA'd. I was mapping a place which many of you will know. And it has walls that are exactly of this ilk. And I spent some time trying to figure out why they were there so that I could reflect that on the map. That's a detail that absolutely no one in the world will know but myself. So for myself, it's important. I like to make sure that they make sense. But do I think that they are required for a fantasy setting? No, because they're fantasy and they're everybody's own version of how their worlds express. But if it's something I build, those walls will have a purpose. If they're sitting by the, for example, separating embankment docks, there is a reason that they are defending that area. And there will be at least one historical event that drove the building of those walls in the first place, because walls don't exist for no reason. Have we got another one?
It's Graham.
Hey!
I think Graham's.
Hey, Graham!
And yeah, there's agreement in the comments. The Doge's Palace in... Is that how you say that? I don't think I've ever said it out loud. The Doge. I really don't know. The palace in Venice is not a castle because it had no need to be built as a fortification thanks to the natural defense of the lagoon.
Totes. And I think Graham's point there was very strong. Building the reason for the walls in there is essential. And I hadn't alighted on taxation, but taxation is a big one.
Yep.
That's one of many reasons, quite. Because you've got a gate to go through now.
Here's a question. I may have translated it wrong. It seemed, what about random events for a city? What do you think of a random tables for a city? Do they different? What would you put in them? Do you like them?
So I love random event tables, but I don't love using them, which is a really bizarre place to be. I love them for inspiration. I very, very rarely would use one at a table because it generally imposes that moment of pause that I don't like, where somebody goes, "Excuse me, I will now take a moment to do a roll and see what we get." Which, if you're going for immersion, which often I am with my roleplay games these days, can be a bit of an immersion breaker. I mean, very occasionally I'll do it for a bit of fun just because I don't have something prepared, but I normally know exactly where everything's going, so it doesn't really matter. But nevertheless, I absolutely adore them as a useful and often powerful tool to inspire and potentially allow a mistaken situation that has occurred to fix itself out with a random encounter that pops up at the table. If you're crossing across town, for example, and you have a nice little random encounter that helps characterize that city, then yes, that's great. And having a random city table in there is a good idea. Not a surprise to see Lindsay go. Oh, there we go. So I'm now going to look down the comments because I still can. I can't bring them up on the screen like she can, but I can do it. And also, Andy Leask, you might have had a point earlier if you're out there. And I go, righty stuff. She says, how else do you tax teeth if people don't have to go through the gate? Absolutely spot on. Hello, you've come down here. What are you doing down here?
The magic is broken. My laptop.
Exciting. Oh, the laptop died, ran out of battery.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was a battery issue. It wasn't a streaming issue. You could go switch off your stream. Hello.
I can't switch off my
stream. We have broken the matrix. Everything's gone wrong. So, how many NPCs do you normally write up and stat for a city? I think this is a great question, and one that I actually tussle with. How many characters should be presented to have a good idea of what that city is before you start running it? Now, there's two different ways for me to answer this. The first one would be to answer it from the creator side, and the other one would be to answer it from the game running side. The game running side, generally, you want all the primary characters that you're going to be using for your story. They are essential. They're not essential for building the city, but they are absolutely essential for building the story that you're intending to put forward. If you don't have a story and you instead are building a sandbox, then you're looking at the primary characters that the PCs are going to involve themselves with at the beginning. They need to be covered. Other than that, because we're talking about how many do I normally write up? That's a slightly different question. Other than that, no more are required. Now, how many do I normally do? If I'm doing it for mine, I don't stat up any. I just don't. I have never needed them. I can create stats on the fly for any game. I have never needed to stat a character in my life, so that's not really an issue. On the other side, oh, maybe it's hey, she's back. That's what you get for using a laptop. You can bring up the question now. I'm currently answering Black Prince Blackmore's, how many PCs do you normally write up stat for a city?
I can't because it's like wiped all of the questions for me.
Oh, well, never mind.
This is the only one I've got.
Never mind. To finish on that one, then when you move towards presenting it as a published adventure or a published part of the city, it's completely different. And it depends on the game that you're writing for. Some games require stats to work, so you need to stat out everything. Others are quite happy with simple verbal descriptions. Others need nothing more than enough to kick off GM imagination. But generally speaking, I like to have at least one NPC per location that we're presenting. But broadly, if it's for myself, I don't stat a thing. All I do is I build up the characters, and often I'll do that when I'm walking. I won't even be doing that when I'm sitting at an NPC computer terminal, figuring it all out. Often it'll just be as I'm walking around, building up all the various social networks, like one of the old White Wolf social networks, City by Night tables. I get an idea of how it all works together, and then away I go. But yeah, normally I don't write up or stat anything for myself.
There was an extreme way to fix my video desyncing issue, though.
Yes, that was an extreme way of resolving it. But now at least we understand why it was.
Oh, no, it wasn't. It literally, I just thought it was plugged in and it actually wasn't. And it had been like wine eating up all its charge. So entirely user error on my behalf. So how do you advise a GM copes with the urban sandbox challenge? PCs suddenly wanting to go to random, unexpected places. Have you answered that one while I was away?
I didn't answer that one. And I think, sadly, the answer to this one is very similar to my answers to previous questions. And that is setting up at the very beginning what the game is, so that all the players understand what they're playing. If you are playing an urban sandbox and you're wanting everyone to engage with an urban sandbox, at the very beginning say, we're going to be playing an urban sandbox game. This is where we're intending to go. Then the PCs are less likely to randomly go to unexpected places across the horizon that can never be attended under normal circumstances. So managing player expectation is the goal there. If, however, you've not done that, and you now find yourself in a position where you're doing that, there are few things that you can do. All of them feel a bit railroady. Like, for example, throwing new obstacles in their path. That is railroady and is something that I would generally prefer not to do, but I have done in the past. You could, for example, present them with other more interesting opportunities that they will instead pursue as you try to drag them back in. Indeed, one of the better motivations for many groups can be, I want to leave, while simultaneously never leaving. Because something is always stopping them from reaching that point. So providing them with those somethings, discussing with the players perhaps beforehand for how best, what sort of motivations their characters have and how they can best be realized through the course of play can be one way of doing that. Or if you know your players and you know the characters that they're playing, you can dangle those things and the players will, like carrots and donkeys, go off in completely different directions. Ultimately, though, it's down to what sort of game you're playing and what sort of expectations your players have and managing those.
And this is why I get players to help describe NPCs, because players regularly try to go off track. Wolfsbane says, I just roll with it and use the players' plans for inspiration at the table.
I tend to do that as well.
Here's the clarification. I was more meaning because cities have so much in them, you can't prep more than a tiny amount of it.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So what do we do if they go to a different part of the city to what you're doing? That's more a question on the city building itself. If you've got a good firm grasp of the primary districts of the city, and you've got a good firm grasp of what sort of things are found in all of those districts, you're going to find that you'll have a broad grasp of what you should be putting in front of them when they get there. So you'll find that hopefully for at least a session, you'll be fine. And then after that, you can then go do the prep for that area. And if they are just, for example, going across city from A through to B, you haven't prepared B, just have some encounters occur along the way, that will give you enough time for you to then fill out B when you get there. It's unless you're playing long 8-hour sessions, it's very rarely the case that you can't stall for a session with some fun, interesting snippet for the PCs to deal with before they reach the next location. Or a mini game or something similar.
Is that why you like mini games so much?
No, I just love mini games.
Distracted by games of chance. Sassy Pancake said, their characters spent 32 sessions trying to leave Uber's right. It was lovely.
That is just the most beautiful thing to read. A lot of work went into Uber's Right, primarily Andy and I, chatting about all the different things there and trying to figure out ways to keep players in town, to ensure that all of the locations and all of the various NPCs presented and the factions and the Bog King and similar were interesting enough to keep people coming back. And by the time you'd hopefully used all of those locations several times, they start telling their own stories. Because your version of the characters will be telling new stories that you wouldn't have originally considered when you read the book.
I had a merchant accidentally bring squigs into Uber's Right mixed in with his produce. The players spent 4 sessions hunting them down.
I do love it. I think we might even have put a hook in there for hunting for the snark or something similar. I can't remember if we actually put that one in the end. It was a reference to, obviously, the infamous hunts with those, but it also popped up in Warhammer Quest. And it's always nice to have those little references to previous products coming through. No, I'm pretty sure we popped that hook in. Haven't read that book in a while now, though.
I think earlier on, the comments that have disappeared, there was a few comments from people saying that they tended to draw on cities and towns that they knew. So while the players maybe didn't know that their template for the town was somewhere they already knew in the real world. And so I suspect that those GMs might use that to their advantage.
I'm running that a little bit. There was a question on Facebook on one of the Warhammer groups regarding my Griswold map. And the Griswold map was a combination of the Griswold that had been presented in first edition, all the various versions of Griswold that had been presented in White Dwarf for supporting various armies through various versions of Warhammer, and a whole host of locations from my hometown, all thrown together into one big amalgam for my own personal game, which is where that map originally came from. And I wrote up an entire town description, wrote all of those places, popped them up onto what was then my website back in the day, which had a forum, and I popped it all in the forums. And that was that. So yes, drawing inspiration from real world locations really can help ground the area with a sense of reality, feeling, and weight, because you might drop things in that are unexpected. So yeah, I recommend that, particularly for your own games and your own players, not necessarily for stuff that you're creating for other people.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've pretty much reached the end of the session. I think I've gone through most of my questions that I had picked up in advance. I'm sorry for the technical gremlins, but at least I now know I can be kicked off and come back on a different device and it appears seamless.
And thanks to everyone that popped along for our midweek shenanigans. We weren't sure if anyone would really turn up at all. So I'm particularly pleased that we got quite a lot of comments coming in. Oh, thank you very much. We put a lot of heart and soul into that. It makes me smile to see those sort of comments, as it always does whenever something that you've worked on receives a good bit of commentary. But yeah, Uber's Reich in particular was something that was hopefully building a bit of a template for how things could be presented later in future. A maximum amount of information in the smallest amount of space we could possibly squeeze it into.
And in case anyone didn't believe that Andy and I actually did live in the same house, you now know. Have the proof of that.
Indeed.
So thank you very much for joining us. Have a happy rest of Wednesday, however long that will be wherever you are. And we'll see you again on Saturday.
Thanks all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.